Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished professional from the Netherlands, Mr. Antonie Fountain. Antonie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Antonie is the managing director of the Voice Network, which is focused on sustainability of cocoa and coffee. And given the amount of work, amazing work that he's been doing, he's been decorated and recognized several times, especially in the areas of sustainable cocoa. So, Antonie, my first question to you is, tell me about your own journey from a faith leader and an aspiring rock star musician to an advocate for sustainable coffee and cocoa.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a long journey, right? So about 25 years ago, I was trying to become a rock star. There's a lot of people out there that were this close to making it in the music business. It's a very hard thing to make. So I was the singer and the front man of a band. We were signed to Universal Records. So we were close, but we didn't make it. And that's always a combination of making the wrong decisions and having a bit of bad luck as well, because you need a lot of good luck if you want to make that. And in the years before that, I'd been deeply involved in Christian youth ministry is the word that it's called. So really bringing teenagers and young adults, trying to give them a sense of meaning in life and inspiring them, et cetera, et cetera. So I've always had this place of kind of, there's more to life than just getting a job and having a mortgage and having a dog and things like that. It's really, there's always been a lot more to it than that. And then about 18 years ago or so, my wife came home with one of the first bars of chocolate from a Dutch small chocolate brand at the time called Tony's Chocolonely, and it said that it was slave-free chocolate on the brand. And I was like, of course it's slave-free. We abolished slavery like 200 years ago. What are you on about? And then my wife started to explain to me what the reality was of forced child labor and other worst forms of child labor in cocoa production in West Africa. And sometimes you hear about something and you're like, oh, that's terrible. Somebody really's got to do something about this. But for me, it came in at a level deeper than that. And I feel this is terrible. I have to do something about that. And I had no idea what to do about it. I mean, I was working in marketing at the time. In the daytime, I was trying to be a rock star. At night, what did I know about doing something about this? But a lot of coincidences happened in the 4 or 5 weeks after that led me to basically give up my job at a marketing firm and to see how can I get involved in the fight against injustice in the cocoa sector. And I've been doing that ever since, 18 years later.
And, you know, when I was preparing for my conversation with you and reading a little bit about you, I now realize that, you know, you may be not a music rock star, but you're certainly a rock star in the sustainability space. So part of the rock star has been met. But let's talk sustainability now, Antonie. What are the main objectives of the voice and vocal networks? And how do these networks collaborate with civil society?
So what we try to do is we realize that sustainability is a very simple concept. It's basically making sure that the current generation gets what they need, while at the same time making sure that future generations are also able to get what they need, right? So it's a balanced approach to livelihoods, environmental protection, human rights, all of these things together, so that actually man and nature and woman and nature, I think it's very important to bring in the equality of gender here, that we find our place in this world that is actually good for this world and for everyone here. So that's what we try to achieve. And how we do that is with both voice and with the vocal network, which is a coffee network that we're setting up at the moment. We realize that it doesn't really matter what system you're in and which part of the world you're in, there will always be power. And this power will always have to be held accountable so that man and nature can coexist in a way that honors both man and nature. And so what we do is we bring together countervailing powers. So we bring together civil societies, unions, research institutes, all of those organizations that have the capacity to hold power accountable, whether that power is government, whether that power is corporate, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
There will be power, that power will have to be held accountable, and that's where you'll find us.
Fascinating. And what, in your view, are some of the biggest challenges facing sustainability in coffee and cocoa?
So the biggest problem, which is like at the root of all of the other problems, is the fact that there are just so many desperately poor people involved in not just coffee and cocoa, but in just about every commodity in the planet. I was just actually in Istanbul a few weeks ago, speaking with a lot of people that were involved in the cotton industry. And the same thing goes there. The minute you find farmers, the minute you find smallholder farmers, you will find people that are very poor. And they're not poor because they're lazy. They're not poor because they don't work hard. They're not poor because they're not inventive or creative. They're poor because the system is designed to keep them poor. The whole idea of a commodity is to actually drive the price as low as you possibly can in the market. That's the concept of it. Yeah. And so what the biggest challenge is to actually find a way to rebuild how we do our global trade system so that it's no longer a race to the bottom, but that there's a really clear floor under which we will not go in treating the poor and the weak of this planet. And I say that this is the biggest problem, not because climate change isn't real, it really is, and it's a real threat to farmers. Not because child labor isn't real, it's really there, and hundreds of millions of children in the world work in child labor, right? Not because gender equality isn't real, not because deforestation isn't happening. All of these things are happening, but all of these things are either caused by the poverty or made so much worse by the poverty. And if we don't solve this poverty, we're not going to solve climate change. We're not going to solve gender inequality. We're not going to solve child labor. We're not going to solve deforestation. So we have to make sure that we find solutions to how the global system treats its poorest.
Well said. And just to follow up on your comment that, we need to find an answer based on the work that you're doing, do you have any specific pointers on how the people in power can actually empower a lot of the very poor people?
So there's two big answers to that question, right? And I think the first big answer there is it cannot be voluntary. Right? I think we've tried sustainability on a voluntary basis for, decades now, and somehow it never works because we're only able to move as fast as the market is allowing us to. So when you look at, for example, companies, there's a lot of good people that work in companies, and there's even a lot of good people that work in bad companies, right? But they can only go as far and as fast as their C-suite allows them. They can only go as far and as fast as their customers allow them to. And that's like this rubber band that the further you try to get ahead, the harder the resistance, and at some point you'll be snapped back. We saw that happen with a company like Unilever a few years ago, where they wanted to be very sustainable, and by now customer backlash and investor backlash has pulled them back to really having to give up a lot of these things. And so we cannot allow protecting the planet, protecting the people on the planet, to be up to the market to see whether or not they feel that there's a business case there. It has to be mandatory. I think the second part of that question, though, is beyond it having to be mandatory, is so far we have always been at a global level making these decisions. And I say we quite consciously. I'm a white, middle-aged man from Europe, right? I mean, the amount of privilege that rests in this single vessel is incredible, right? But we've actually, as the global north, so to speak, the decisions as to how we design the global trade system still are made in the boardrooms and corridors of power of Europe and North America. And despite the kind of the ascendancy of China and India, how we've created the global system, the rules that we play by still are made by people that look suspiciously much like me. And so the second thing, beyond it needing to be mandatory, it also needs to be inclusive, which means that all of the voices need to be at the table. Nothing about us without us. And if we start doing that, we can also redress some of the key problems, which is that because the decisions are always made in the boardrooms and in the corridors of power, the decisions that are made there are always acceptable and not too disruptive to the boardrooms and to the corridors of power. But actually, we're going to need decisions that are disruptive to those boardrooms and corridors of power. And we're not going to get those disruptive decisions until we put the people in the room as well that are able to challenge that.
Well said. Well said. My next question is, Antonie, how is technology, or how can technology be used to promote sustainability?
So that's a fascinating debate that we see in agriculture across the world at the moment, right? And we've actually got two big streams of thinking there. You've got what they call the prophets and the wizards. And so the wizards are all about technology and bringing in kind of, if we just have lots of intensive agriculture, or we have lots of high yield systems, we're going to solve the problem. The prophets are saying, no, what we need to do, it needs to be a human scale, it needs to be organic, it needs to be regenerative, it needs to be nature friendly. And what we've seen is that there's a real split between those two. And I'm not so comfortable between that split that's there. I actually think that you need to look at what's the specific problem that we're trying to solve, and then come up with the appropriate tool, so to speak, right? And what I often think is missing in both the kind of the more prophet and the more wizard side of the conversation is that we step away from the discussion of power. And for me, it keeps coming back to that, because if you try to solve the problem through technology, but you don't do something about the distribution of power, what you're going to do is this technology is going to put way more power in the hands of people that already have that. Right. In another sector, we've seen that happen very much in the last 5-6 years since the pandemic, where the rich are getting so much richer because we're not doing something about this, right? And so some of the arguments around like intensification and technology as a solution in agriculture, they're saying if we would grow more crops per hectare, then we would need less land, and so we could give more back to nature. Yes, we could. But if we don't do something about power, the powerful will say, what a waste of giving this back to nature. Look at how productive this land could be. We're actually going to use this as when we're just going to increase our output. And so you need to do something about that power so that the technology actually finds its right place. But on the other side of the spectrum, there are also people that are so against technology that also gets in the way of things, because actually increasing productivity per hectare is really important. Diversifying income is really important. Using technology to get much better planting material, using technology to get much higher yields, using technology to get much better varieties, etc., is really important. And even there can be a real use for using, for example, agrochemicals, provided they are used properly and in small enough doses that they don't do harm, but big enough doses that they do what they're supposed to do, right? Absolutely. So there's a real issue around technology there that I feel we're continuously getting wrong, because we're putting technology first. But we need to put technology second, because there are no technological solutions to what in essence are political problems. And what we're dealing with at a global scale are not technological issues. They're political issues. And with political, I mean they're about the distribution of risk, the distribution of reward, and the distribution of responsibility, the 3 R's. Those are the political problems we need to solve. We solve those, technology will follow.
Well said. Great response. Thank you. You know, when we started our conversation a few minutes back, you told me about the chocolate bar your wife brought back, which had slave free. And my question is, how important is consumer awareness and education in promoting sustainability?
I'm going to say something that might be a little bit surprising and controversial here, but I do not believe in it at all.
Okay.
And the reason for that is, these topics are so complex,
Mm.
right? I think it would be fair to say that, if there's like 20 leading experts on sustainable cocoa in the world,
Mm.
and you would be asked to put up a list, I'd often be put in that list of the 20 experts in the world that around sustainable cocoa. When I go into a store, I even find it hard to choose what to buy
Right.
because there's so much complexity in there.
Mm.
If I, as one of the world's leading experts, am not entirely sure, how can you expect your great aunt that read something about this somewhere 15 years ago to make an informed decision, right? And this comes back to the point I made earlier. This shouldn't be voluntary. It
Right.
shouldn't be up to consumer choice. It shouldn't be up to supply and demand whether or not we trash the planet and the people that live on it. That should be a given. Those should be the guardrails of our economy. And those guardrails are missing, and we need them.
Very interesting. And therefore, a follow-up question from this is that given the fact that you've said that this cannot be voluntary, what are some key policies or regulations you believe are necessary?
So we're living in a really interesting time, Ashutosh, because just in the last 4 or 5 years, we're starting to see a paradigm shift. So since the late 70s, early 80s, we've seen something called the Washington Consensus Rule. And that Washington Consensus was based on deregulation. The less rules, the better it is for the economy, the better it is for the economy, the better it is for the people on it, right? That is changing fundamentally, at least in Europe. We're seeing a massive shift there, where in some individual member states in Europe, regulations around sustainability are coming in place saying, hey, we agree, it shouldn't be voluntary anymore. So in France, you've got the devoir de vigilance law. In Germany, you've got the Lieferkettengesetz. In the Netherlands, there's a law that's being developed. But more importantly, at the level of the European Union itself, we're seeing a suite of 5, 6 different regulations coming together to say, hey, look, sustainability needs to move from a nice to have to a license to operate. And so we're seeing regulations around deforestation, like the EUDR, the European Union's deforestation regulation. But just a few weeks ago, the European Union also passed something called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD. Not the sexiest of names, but what that actually is going to require from companies is that companies are no longer allowed to look away from the problems in their supply chain. They're going to have to acknowledge their problems, and then they're going to have plans that are adequate to meet those challenges. And then there's also a regulation around reporting around this, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that says you're going to have to transparently report about the problems you find in your supply chain. There's a law called the Green Claims Directive, which says if you're making sustainability claims on environmental issues, we're going to check whether those claims are true or not, or whether you're just greenwashing everything. There's a regulation on forced labor, and the United States also have a regulation on forced labor coming in, right? There's a regulation on unfair trading practices that's coming in. So all of a sudden, we're living in a time where 5 years ago, if you would have asked me this question, I would have said, we really need regulation, but we don't have it. Now, just looking back at the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a sea change. And so what I think is a lot of professionals, whether they're sustainability professionals or not, are not looking to the future with the right lens, because they're looking to the future with the lens of the past. But the future will not look like the past, because we are living in a momentous hinge of how we're organizing the economy. And so the future will have to be looked at with the lens of sustainability as a license to operate, no longer as a nice to have.
Well said. And do you see a role for civil society?
Absolutely. I mean, that's my job. That's what I've been doing for the last almost 2 decades, is civil society, when they do their job well, they don't always, but when they do their job well, their role is to speak truth to power. Whether that is corporations, whether that is governments, whether that is other vested interests. There's a lot of different ways. It could be local rulers. It could be, there are so many places that you can speak out against, and that you have to speak out against, because the job of the civil society is actually to come together and to speak for those that are not being spoken for enough, right? And so that role for civil society comes in at every level, right? My job often is to work at the global level, but I would be sunk if it wasn't for our vast number of allies working in communities, working directly with stakeholders, working directly in forests, working directly in agricultural areas across the world, bringing together those people that do the actual hard work of day-to-day farming, of day-to-day animal husbandry, of day-to-day fishing, of day-to-day forest conserving. Their voices need to be at the table. And the only way you can get those voices at the table is by bringing people together. A famous Dutch architect about 150 years ago, he chose to always build with bricks. And he said, and that was a purposeful choice. He said, because a brick as a single unit is puny. But if you organize it in masses, it has power. And for me, this is what we do as civil society. Every day, we build beautiful constructions out of these individual bricks, because and not only is that an effective strategy, it actually historically has been the only thing that has ever moved the needle positively. It's when workers and civil society and rights holders at the beginning of a supply chain unite, come together, and fight for the common good rather than for their own.
Well said. And Anthony, when I speak to a lot of the young around the world, the millennials, the Gen Zs, now Gen Alpha, there's a lot of consciousness amongst them about sustainability. My question is, how do you see the role of ethical consumerism evolving in the future?
I think it will grow. I remember when I started working, it was quite normal to still smoke cigarettes behind your desk at work here in Europe, right? If one were to do that now, you'd be run out of the building immediately. You're like, what are you doing? And just 20 years ago, 25 years ago, this was still standard operating procedure, right? And I think a lot of the unsustainable aspects that we have in 10, 15, 20 years time at best, we'll be looking back at how we used to do things. And we're going like, how could you possibly think that was normal, right? And so that's where ethical consumerism becomes something that says, this is the norm. And this is what we're going to hold you to, because this is how we believe it should be done. I think we're seeing a similar movement globally around inappropriate behavior in the workplace, right? We've really seen a major shift just in the last 10 years as to how people approach that. And I actually think it's also coupled with a better understanding of a lot of people of what is and what isn't appropriate, right? And I think that's the same thing where we go towards sustainability as well. At some point, being unsustainable will be considered the same as making highly sexist remarks about the secretary, right? And how consumer behavior operates in that, I think that there's going to be a stronger and stronger chance of cancel culture happening when you're not being sustainable, right? And that's the market doing its job as well. Now, the big danger that you have there is that this cancel culture can also come up at a moment when it's not well informed. I mean, it goes very quickly, right? So you could have heard something somewhere, and it can go quite quickly then. Now, companies have done some absolutely evil and horrendous things, and companies continue to do absolutely evil and horrendous things. And when they do, they should be called out. But the trick there is always going to find the right, I wouldn't say balance, but there's always a tension between calling something out and being well informed enough to call it out. And that doesn't always fall the right way, so to speak.
Well said. And you have time for one more question. And this is for you. What has been your most rewarding experience in your work with sustainability?
I'm not sure that I can confine that to just one thing, Ashutosh, because I really have a fantastic job, and which is also a calling. As I said earlier, this is something
Yeah.
I thought I have to do something about. So it feels like a calling deep within. I'd say there's three things that immediately spring to mind. And the first thing is that in the last 20 years, we have seen the voices of the global South become more and more present and visible, definitely in the cocoa. In the cocoa sector, in the cocoa conversation. So that's one of the things that I'm really, really happy about. I think the second thing that's been a major milestone, and we've played a key role in as the cocoa sector, is this regulatory shift in Europe. I wouldn't, it's not only been us. Like, these massive changes require thousands and thousands and thousands of different people doing a lot of the lifting. But I know the cocoa sector played an important role in driving forward the idea for regulation. And in fact, the cocoa sector was the first sector where the companies came out and said, we need regulation because we cannot do this just on a voluntary basis. And I know this because we helped bring the cocoa sector together to come out with these statements. And at that moment, when that statement came out, the European Commission was like, this is interesting. You guys never ask for laws. You always ask us not to do laws. Would you come over for a chat? And so all the way at the beginning, about 5 years ago, when the Commission started working on the vast majority of these regulations, the cocoa sector was there being a cheerleader for it. And I think that that's a major step forward. And I think the third major thing is around poverty and framing that debate in the cocoa sector. You can't solve poverty just through these technological issues, right? Power becomes part of this. And power is also the risk, the reward, and the responsibility. And when we're talking about reward, we're talking about how much does the farmer get for what he's growing, right? And we haven't solved that problem yet. But after almost 20 years of fighting hard for it, the whole sector now is talking about how much should we pay a farmer? And that's a fundamentally different question than, oh, the market is always right. And so I would say the fact that the voices of the South are at the table now, I would say that we have this regulation and we played a key role to do that. And thirdly, we're talking about what the farmer should receive. And that's a major step forward as well. So those are three major milestones that I'm really grateful for.
Amazing. On that note, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your own journey from a rock star, an aspiring rock musician.
I was about to say, I never made it to that level. So,
but I think our conversation on sustainability, not just for coffee and cocoa, which is an area that you specialize in, but covering much more of sustainability. I love the way you brought in the farmers and how it is their right, or how much they must be compensated more. I had never thought of it the way you said it, that empowering cannot be voluntary. I think that is a very powerful statement that you've made. We covered a lot of ground on sustainability. I could keep talking to you for a long time, but because there's so much knowledge you have in this area. But thank you so much for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thanks for having me, Ashutosh. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.